The shooting range. In this episode, pages of history, the bumpy ride of the other T-54, round study, picking shells for Soviet MBTs, and metal beasts, challenging aircraft. Well, now that we've played the most exciting new vehicles, why don't we take something old, pull it out from the far corner of the hangar, dust it off, and enjoy it one more time. Like this machine right here. It's a ground attack version of a legendary Soviet fighter all the way back from the Korean War, and its name is the MiG-15bis ISH. Unlike the classic fighter, this modification has two large hardpoints integrated right into the wing panels. The solution does little to improve the aerodynamics, of course, but you wouldn't feel it anyways. The 15bis isn't an aircraft whose flight performance deserves a complaint. The extra air drag those hardpoints produce is easily compensated for by a strong engine. In takeoff mode, this heart can push almost 2,500 kilogram forces. Modern fighters taught us to appreciate larger numbers, but believe us, it's impressive for the early 50s. Thrust-to-weight ratio is the very thing you should use to build your MiG strategy in air combat. It climbs well and keeps its speed up, which makes this MiG a great pick for boom and zoom and energy attacks. It's no stranger to dogfighting either, especially if you force your enemy to climb up. The climbing spiral is the strongest move for the MiG-15. What it really dislikes, though, is rolling from one wing to another, so try to avoid doing that when you can. There's another peculiarity that has to do with the plane's weaponry. It has a single 37mm and two 23mm autocannons, which are amazing against huge, clumsy bombers. Hitting agile fighters with them, however, is a special form of art that takes firm hands and nerves of steel. Each time you line up the sights, you can't help but mutter, "Almost there, just a little bit more," and half your ammo misses again. But all you need is just a couple of hits. We must admit, this is one of the few weapons that do take a while to get the hang of. Now, the full potential of this ground attack version is unlocked in mixed battles. It can carry many more bombs than the base version, but there's something extra as well. The special feature is the unique S-1OF rockets, mounted in a look-down position. At first, this design might feel quirky and uncomfortable, but your ballistic computer will help you calculate the hit area just like it does on modern attack jets. Once you get used to shooting your own legs, you'll be able to score a frag with each of the 8 rockets. Well, that's the kind of plane the MiG-15bis ISH is. It challenges the owner at every step, but if you stay loyal to it and get the hang of its quirks, its huge potential is all yours. When you hear T-54, you probably think of a Soviet machine, the Kalashnikov of the tank world. But in the 1950s, the American engineers created a machine with a similar name, the T-54. Unlike the Soviet tank, the American T-54 remained one of the many prototypes mostly known to enthusiasts and experts. However, had its creators actually managed to reach the desired results, the entire MBT class could have developed in a different way. Soon after World War II, the Americans realized they needed a replacement for the Patton tanks. All tanks of the family, with the exception of the M48, were clear descendants of the Pershing and were outdated even before their development was complete. The Pattons were given a firepower buff thanks to heat shells, but that was a temporary measure. The Army required a new tank, with better armor and a stronger gun. One of the candidates for the main caliber of the future tank was the 105mm T5 cannon. It was created in the last years of the war to destroy German fortifications and damage King Tigers. With a barrel length of 65 calibers and a high velocity, it made a good impression. The only flaws were separate loading, size, and mass. A lightweight version using single-piece shells was made, named the T-140. The engineers were going to install it onto the medium tank and even add an autoloader. They've already had a similar experience in automating the loading of naval guns. On the other side of the ocean, the French even managed to put this mechanism into the turret of the light AMX-13. It would have been a shame to leave such a challenge unanswered. The new generation American tank simply had to have an autoloader too. The T-54 was built using a two-piece oscillating turret and a fixed gun placement. The design made it easier to put the gun into the loading position, but created other difficulties. For instance, it was impossible to make the turret airtight. Besides, the crew had to rotate the shell drum at least once after every shot, and sometimes even more depending on where the required ammunition was placed. The engineers spent a few years trying to make this mechanism more reliable, but ultimately failed. The airtightness of the turret was also turning into a burning issue. The US High Command expected the next war to be a nuclear one, and they weren't alone in the thought. So the T-54E1 project was ultimately discarded. There was an attempt to install the new gun in a second modification of the tank, with a conventional manual loading mechanism, but the military didn't appreciate the new vehicle either. The T-54 was soon replaced by the experimental T-95, but that one too was abandoned. A few years later, the US Army accepted a new tank into service. It's been finally made. The M60 with the British 105mm cannon became a long-standing staple of the American ground forces. Despite its impressive performance, the T-54 with its T-140 gun stayed a little-known episode of history. The effort put into it wasn't lost, though. Many years later, the world saw the M60A1, and its wedge-shaped turret was vaguely familiar. APF-SDS, ATGM, high explosive, armor-piercing. Soviet MBTs can shoot almost any kind of shell. What do you need this variety for? Which of these shells should you take to battle? Today we'd like to answer these questions using the latest descendants of the Soviet tank designs. And we'll start by discarding heat shells, since these are almost useless against modern ERA and composite armor found at high ranks. Use the early sub-caliber as your main shell while you spade the vehicle, but switch to the 3B M60 Svinets as soon as you can. Let's take a closer look at the latter. The top Soviet APF-SDS can penetrate up to 580 millimeters of armor. Let's have a small test of its efficiency by firing at one of the heaviest armored vehicles in the game, the Swedish STRV-122. 500 meters should be a good enough distance. The lower front plate is a breeze. The area under the turret isn't an issue either. But the upper part of the hull and the wedge-shaped cheeks with composite screens refuse to be penetrated. All you can do when you only see the turret is damage the gun. Alternatively, you can use a different type of shell, the 30F-26. This good old AG round carries more than 5 kilos of explosives and TNT equivalent, enough to demolish an armor plate 42 millimeters thick. Even the STRV turret isn't a problem for this one. Now we can shoot at the top-mounted devices and the turret roof without exposing our own vehicle, and the overpressure will knock out the crew. But what do you do if you have an HE shell in the breach and your enemy surprises you up close? In this case, you should aim under the turret to damage the hull roof. The high explosive shell has an obvious flaw that complicates long-range shots: low velocity. There is, however, a round with truly amazing ballistics, the 9M119M1. It's an anti-tank guided missile with a tandem warhead and a penetration rate of 850 millimeters. Launching it at this target gets you almost the same result as firing a top APF-SDS shell. Meanwhile, the ATGM carries even more explosives than the HE shell, so it can also penetrate the roof of the turret or the hull. The missile comes with its own flaw, though. Its velocity is only 445 meters per second, 4 times slower than the finned shell. It's inconvenient even in close combat, and at medium range it turns into a huge issue. If you also remember that you have to guide the missile all the way until it hits, it becomes clear that the ATGM is a poor choice for the main caliber. In tank-to-tank combat, this missile is only useful when firing so far away that even APF-SDS shells lose their efficiency. But that's a super rare situation. Where the missile shines is firing at helicopters. Being able to guide it is a godsend in these cases. Tell us in the comments what tanks you'd like to see next. Meanwhile, it's time for us to answer some of your questions. The first question was sent by a player called Makarov. Why is the M247 identified as an F-16 on RWR? Hello. It's because they use the same radar system. The M247 is equipped with the same tracking radar as the F-16 fighter, and radar warning receivers can't tell if the signal comes from a ground vehicle. Jacob Hannon asks, what's the chrome ring between the engine and the cockpit on the LA series fighters and interceptors, like the LA-200, LA-7, etc.? What purpose do they serve? Hi, Jacob. These are guiding rails for the engine hood. They're made of cast or forged aluminum and left unpainted to keep their precise geometry intact. Another question comes from Scar Khan. Even with the new nuke, there's no button on console, so you still have to leave the vehicle. Hi, Scar Khan. Not having to leave the vehicle was one of the main changes we made to nuclear bombers in realistic battles. Once you get close to 2,000 spawn points, you should be able to see a special button in the UI to switch to the bomber. Akash Dobush writes, why does the speedometer turn red in some tanks? Hey, it happens if you're using a vehicle that can't launch HEGMs at high speed. The red color of the speedometer means you can't launch a missile. And the last comment for today was written by Mathis. When are we getting stealth aircraft? Hi, Mathis. They're already here. Pick any you can spot and go ahead. That's it for today. You've been watching The Shooting Range by Gaijin Entertainment, and the next episode will premiere the following Sunday at 4 p.m. GMT or noon Eastern Time. Subscribe and click the bell if you don't want to miss our next videos. Don't forget to throw some water to make stealth vehicles visible. Leave a like, share your thoughts and comments, and see you next week.